Pennsylvania is the Transylvania of America. Just as in the land of Count Dracula, Pennsylvania has some incredible forests. It is also cold, and could well be the scene of one of the worst nightmares for at least one American, President Donald Trump. Right now, we are going to explain why that is. Remember that American voters do not decide directly which president they want, but choose the composition of the Electoral College. The Electoral College is made up of 538 voters. The distribution of Electoral College members is more or less according to the population of each state. And this is where Pennsylvania becomes very important, because we're talking about the 5th most populous state in the United States. So in Pennsylvania, there are no less than 20 elector seats at stake. There are many states that traditionally vote for the same party, but there are also states where victory is more closely contested. They are the so-called swing states, and Pennsylvania is one of them. In 2016, Trump won this state. But in 2020, it is not clear what will happen. There are even polls that are very favourable to Biden. They indicate that Pennsylvania could be instrumental in bringing about a change of tenant in the White House. So what may happen in states like Pennsylvania has prompted headlines like this.
Trump refuses to commit to accepting election results. Forbes.
And now I'm sure you're all wondering, but what is the problem? That Donald Trump only trusts that the elections are clean when he wins? Why does Trump say that he doesn't trust the election results? Well, the explanation basically comes down to postal voting. Keep in mind that in US elections, in all but 2 states, the party that gets the most votes in a state takes all its representatives in the Electoral College. It doesn't matter if a candidate wins the election by 1 vote or by 1 million. The most important thing is to win. That's why a lot of attention is paid to Pennsylvania. Because although 20 electoral votes may not seem like much to you, keep in mind that, along with Florida, Pennsylvania is the swing state that puts the most votes into play. And in 2016, it was a matter of just 44,000 votes in a state of almost 13 million people that were enough to make all 20 of those electors fall on Trump's side, even though the difference was only 0.7%. And of course, what Trump won by a narrow margin, he could also lose by a narrow margin. Now, those 20 electors could be for Biden. And don't lose sight of the fact that we're talking about 20 votes that one candidate wins and 20 votes that the other candidate fails to win. 4 years ago, 77 Electoral College votes separated Trump and Clinton. From these figures, Pennsylvania represents 40 votes. Halfway to the Democrats' turnaround. That's why Trump is so concerned. This is an election where every detail could make a difference.
Because of mail-in ballots, 2020 will be the most rigged election in our nation's history. Unless this stupidity is ended, we voted during World War I and World War II with no problem. But now they're using COVID in order to cheat by using mail-ins. Donald Trump.
So, with Halloween just around the corner, the question is, why is voting by mail so scary to Trump? How might it affect states like Pennsylvania? More importantly, how do Pennsylvanians view this election? Today on VisualPolitik, we're going to answer all of these questions, but first, let's take a look at some history.
Sleepy Joe rides through Pittsburgh.
There are a few places that you can feel as close to the history of the United States as you do in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a state where Philadelphia is located, and it was in this city that, in the 18th century, the independence of the United States was declared. All this while ringing the Liberty Bell in the Independence Hall, a bell that you can still visit today. During the Civil War in the 19th century, Pennsylvania was the scene of one of the most decisive battles, the Battle of Gettysburg. And during the 20th century, Pittsburgh steel was the material from which New York's great skyscrapers, like the Empire State Building, were made. So basically, Pennsylvania is rich with American history. In fact, friends, to talk about steel is to talk about the high point in Pennsylvania's economy. The steel industry was the state's main industry, along with coal mining. But I think that you will agree with me that these are industries that have been losing importance since World War II. And since then, new ways of generating energy have displaced coal. Meanwhile, steel has been imported from Asian countries such as China. However, in many cases, this means taking advantage of unfair competition or even dumping. Dumping is a commercial practice that consists of selling a product below its normal price, or even below its cost of production, in order to eliminate competitors take over the market. A very risky tactic for a private company, but within reach of Chinese companies, which are strongly supported by the state. Therefore, many industries in Pennsylvania have been slowly closing their doors. Pennsylvania was once very important to the US economy, but for several decades now, its influence has been declining. Today we find a state without major cities beyond Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. 27% of the population is rural, while throughout the rest of the United States, the average is 19%. So many of the steel mills are gone, but Pennsylvanians still have their farms. It is a state in which the primary sector also plays a very important role. They are one of the largest producers of mushrooms, apples, and dairy products. Of course, right now, you are asking, so given the state of affairs, what party do Pennsylvanians usually vote for? Well, as I mentioned before, Pennsylvania is a swing state, and things are usually pretty close. But we could say that in the last few decades, it has been a Democratic state. Since 1988, Pennsylvanians voted for the Democratic Party presidential candidate 6 times in a row. Moreover, its current governor Tom Wolf is from the Democratic Party. He took office in 2014 and is pretty popular. That's why what happened 4 years ago was such a surprise. Pennsylvania's 20 Electoral College voters went to Donald Trump. The anti-globalization speech and America First message actually worked. Many people, including many Pennsylvanians, voted for Trump to do just that.
Donald Trump to slap 25% tariff on steel imports, Financial Times.
That was the beginning of the cascade of tariffs that brought about the trade war with China. And now that Trump's first term is over, it's time to take stock. In 2001, Pennsylvania's steel industry employed 54,000 workers. George Bush's presidency ended with 24% fewer jobs as a result of the Great Recession and Chinese dumping. Obama's 8 years in office did not improve things much. Employment in the sector fell another 18%. In contrast, the data with Trump has improved somewhat. Employment in Pennsylvania's steel mills rose 4%. Of course, the industry has far from recovered, but at least Trump has managed to stop the trend. So basically, we could say that Pennsylvania is one of the states that has gained from Trump's policies. And yes, it's true, many other states and many other industries have been hurt by steel tariffs. But we have to recognize one thing: Donald Trump has created a trend around the world. Listen up.
Canada's Trudeau hits China for dumping steel on global markets, Business Inquirer. EU extends anti-dumping duties on Chinese steel, Euractiv.
So we agree that Trump has made the correct call. However, he possibly overdid it, and his solutions were not the most appropriate. It is one thing to take a series of targeted measures in particular sectors, but it is quite another to launch an entire trade war. The exchange of tariffs between China and the United States has made it difficult for Pennsylvanian companies to sell abroad, and has increased their costs. And this is the downside of protectionism. Yes, in the short term, steel exporters have regained some of the market they lost, but other industries are paying the price.
Trump tariffs cost Pennsylvanians more than $700 million in 2019, WITF.
This cost increase has spread to many sectors of the economy in the state. Also, the agricultural sector. Still, Trump is not planning to back down. This is his policy, and America First is what makes him different from previous White House tenants. It also serves to appeal to good patriots. That's why he says China would rather sit down and negotiate trade agreements with Biden than with him.
They'd say to Sleepy Joe, "Sir, just sign right there." "Oh, okay. I'll sign." We've been losing hundreds of billions of dollars a year to China. It has to stop, and they understand that.
Trump has taken the steps people expected him to take, but the result isn't quite what they expected. So his worst nightmares are about to come true. This year, 2020, is a horror movie for Trump. Let's take a closer look right now.
Trump's Ferratu, the COVID vampire.
Is there anything worse than being in Transylvania surrounded by vampires? Yes, there is. That, besides sucking your blood, you get the coronavirus. In the United States, there have already been 220,000 deaths from coronavirus and more than 8 million infections. Pennsylvania rates 8th for the state with the most deaths by COVID-19, more than 8,500. The infections already surpass 180,000. There is a particularly serious circumstance in Pennsylvania. It ranks 4th on the list of states with the oldest population in the country. It was also one of the places most affected at the beginning of the pandemic. The only reason the numbers aren't worse is because they don't have large metropolises, other than Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Pennsylvania's governor, moderate Democrat Tom Wolf, took confinement measures for some counties in mid-March, before extending them to all of Pennsylvania. The de-escalation was also county by county, and in different phases that lasted until early June. Was there an alternative? Well, in May, there was at least one man who thought there was.
Good people of Pennsylvania want their freedom now and are fully aware of what that entails. The Democrats are moving slowly across America for political purposes. They would wait until November 3rd. If we're up to them, don't play politics. You're safe. Move quickly, Donald Trump.
Here is one more example of how tight the presidential elections are going to be. As you can imagine, the incidence of the coronavirus in Pennsylvania was concentrated, especially in the beginning in Philadelphia. Philadelphia County massively supports the Democrats. 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton got 82% of the vote. That was almost 500,000 votes more than Trump. A brutal figure. In Pittsburgh, the Democrats also won, but the fight was more balanced. In contrast, rural Pennsylvania is closer to the Republican Party and is emerging relatively unscathed from the pandemic. So you can get an idea of who supported President Trump's calls to end the quarantine in Pennsylvania.
President Trump is recovering from the coronavirus, and so is America.
There were even major protests against social distancing. What's more, the Republicans controlled the state legislature and tightened the cord on de-escalation so much that they forced the governor to use his veto power.
Governor Wolf vetoes bills to allow counties, various industries to reopen. WJACTV.
We therefore find an even more polarized electorate in Pennsylvania than we did 4 years ago. The divide has widened between the urban pro-Democrats and supporters of restrictive measures to contain the virus, and the rural pro-Republicans who believe that Governor Wolf's measures have stifled the state's economy and its businesses. The infection of Trump, his wife, his son, and half of the White House has certainly been a blow to Republican aspirations. We no longer need any further proof that the coronavirus is rampant in the United States. This is not to say that we are much better off in the rest of the world, but understand that the American voter cares about his or her own. So in Pennsylvania, the Republicans have looked for other issues to hurt the Democrats with, and another issue they think they could take advantage of is fracking. Fracking is a hydrocarbon extraction technique that consists of injecting a special fluid at high pressure into the subsoil to break up the rock and extract the gas or the oil. It requires the use of more expensive technology than that used in conventional energy fields. The high price that crude oil reached in the last 15 years made fracking viable, the subject of a whole energy revolution in the United States. Since then, Pennsylvania has become the second largest natural gas producing state in the United States, only behind Texas. So Trump has tried to use the Democrats' opposition to fracking to gain support in the areas surrounding Pittsburgh. And Biden has had to halt the greenest faction of the Democratic Party that hopes to end fracking. He knows that announcing such a measure could end his chances of winning over Pennsylvania's voters. But then again, he did choose Senator Kamala Harris as his running mate. And I assure you that Pennsylvanians have good memories. Here is Kamala Harris in September 2019.
This devastating practice.
There's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking. So, yeah. And
You heard it yourself. Kamala Harris herself, future Vice President of the United States, if Biden wins, and possibly more if anything else happens in the near future. She knows where she stands. She is in favor of banning fracking. So it's clear. This election in Pennsylvania is going to be very, very close. Who knows if it will be decisive? But now, let's talk about something that could make one or the other candidate win. Listen up.
Nightmare on Pennsylvania Avenue.
We now know that Donald Jr. and Ivanka Trump were not afraid of the terrifying characters of the 80s like Freddy Krueger. No, their nightmares were played by the boogeyman, but the boogeyman who brings the mail order votes. Outside the United States, little is being said about this issue, and it is possible that from November 4th onwards, little else will be talked about. At stake would be the person who gets to reside at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. And of course, you can think about whether at this point in the film, voting by mail is really such an important issue. Well, remember that it's 2020 and anything is possible. 2020 has changed the rules of social behavior in so many areas, and also electoral behavior. The virus is in the streets, and there are many people who would prefer to avoid crowded places like polling stations. States have had to rush through new methods of voting because some did not contemplate the possibility of voting before Election Day without a justified reason. It is expected that in this election, mail-in voting will skyrocket because people are afraid. And of course, in California, we're not talking about a handful of votes, but in the swing states, it could be crucial. That may be the case in Pennsylvania. Traditionally, for a vote by mail to be valid in the United States, it had to arrive at the county elections office on election day at the latest. In August, the US Postal Service itself warned Pennsylvanians that the backlog in their offices could cause their votes not to be counted if they did not vote more than 15 days before the election. All this has culminated in a new dispute between Republicans and Democrats that has ended up in court.
Pennsylvania Supreme Court sides with Democrats, extends mail-in ballot deadlines to 3 days after Election Day. AP News.
In this way, Pennsylvania will consider the votes that arrive at the electoral office as good until 3 days after November 3rd. Republicans have appealed this decision at the federal level to the Supreme Court. But hold on a minute, because the fights between Republicans and Democrats have only just begun. Republicans believe the conditions are in place for the electoral fraud of the century. They've also called for ballots to be rendered invalid for voters whose signatures are not accurately identified with the officially registered one, or that voting by mail directly through a mailbox not be allowed. Everything is in the hands of the courts, and the worst thing is that in other states like Ohio or Texas, the story is similar, a chaos of gigantic proportions. But to understand what is happening, you have to take a look at this. According to this poll conducted by the Center for Opinion Research in Pennsylvania, more than half of Democrats plan to vote by mail, while only 10% of the Republicans plan to do so. In 2016, there were 300,000 mail ballots in Pennsylvania. This year, that number will probably increase 5- or 6-fold, bringing the total closer to 2 million votes. This is when it pays to remember that in 2016, the elections in the state were decided by a ridiculous margin of votes. Trump had 44,000 more votes than Hillary Clinton, and I'll give you another fact. Before the postal vote was counted, the Republican margin was only 20,000 votes higher. Where am I going with all this? Well, I want to get to the point that election night promises strong emotions. It is certain that the count in Pennsylvania will begin in favor of Donald Trump, thanks to the count in rural areas, which is faster than in the cities. In addition, there are predictions from The Economist that even with up to 70% progress in the mail ballot counts, Pennsylvania may still hold onto a Republican victory. And here we have two scenarios. Imagine that those 20 Electoral College votes at stake in the end are the decisive ones. How would Donald Trump view a shift from a Republican Pennsylvania to a Democratic Pennsylvania? Furthermore, I'm not talking about a last-minute change, but rather after counting all the votes that have arrived by Friday, November 6th. I can imagine you all on Twitter just constantly pressing F5. Then there is the other alternative. If things are very tight, it could be that if a figure as low as 3% of the postal votes were not counted because they arrived late, or if they were not considered valid for whatever reason, the balance would fall one way or another. So far, absentee voting is Donald Trump's worst nightmare. After November 3rd, it could be everyone's worst nightmare. Could something equally bad happen if Trump didn't accept the election result? Well, yes, and they are already preparing us for it.
Biden says chicanery at polls is the only way he could lose U.S. election. Reuters.
It is likely that if there is no victory to one of the two contenders, it will be a mess. Whatever happens, we will be keeping you posted here on VisualPolitik, but now the questions are over to you. Do you think we will have a final result on election day, or will we have to wait? Do you think the Pennsylvania results will be so close this time? Furthermore, if you were from the state, would you still be with Trump? Or would you bet on Biden?
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.